São Paulo's 14th Court was known for its efficiency cold and its almost hostile atmosphere. The grey walls, the hard wooden benches, and the watches without sound were part of a routine where the names passed faster than human gestures. That day, case 0874 barely occupied a line in the file. Antonio Ribeiro, 73 years old, accused of breaking and entering. No one raised the view when the man was driven handcuffed to her bench. He walked slowly, as if each step weighed more than the last. He had the lowered gaze, the face covered in deep wrinkles, and an expression that was not one of guilt, but of resignation. His threadbare coat hung as if it weren't for him belonged, and his shoes they seemed hold on, just by the will to keep walking. The prosecutor neither not even dissembled his annoyance. He muttered that it was another homeless person disturbing the peace of the decent citizens. The assigned public defender neither didn't even show up. Nobody objected. For the majority of those present, it was just an older man who had decided to sleep behind a bakery during a night of 4 degrees below zero. They had found him huddled among empty sacks and the smell of bread old. There was no stolen anything. There was no forced lock. I was just looking for survive the night. The substitute judge did not seem interested in extend the audience more than necessary, but just as he was about to make a quick decision, a figure entered the room side door of the room, the titular judge, Larissa Montenegro, with the case file in the hand and the face suddenly pale. Larissa had started his day like any other, reviewing minor cases from his office in the second floor. But when his assistant Yu left a folder marked Audience Simple, something in the name of the accused did stop. Antonio Carlos Ribeiro. He stared at those 3 words for long seconds, as if his mind refused to process them. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was the same name that your brother Enrique had repeatedly mentioned in the letters sent from the front before dying on a mission in the interior of the Amazon. Antonio Ribeiro, the man who saved me life, he said in one of them. His heart gave an overturn. He immediately went down to the living room without say a word. I needed to see it with their own eyes. And there he was, old, wasted, invisible to everyone, but not to her. Without get-up suspicions, Larissa stopped her procedure and requested that a public defender out replaced by someone of his trust. He gave the name of Eduardo Ferraz, a renowned criminal lawyer, more accustomed to courts higher than cases of homelessness. Eduardo himself thought it was a joke, but when the judge, it looked fixedly and said in a low voice, "It's important, trust in me," he couldn't refuse. Up to date next, he introduced himself in the small courtroom office with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. It didn't take long in understanding that I was facing something bigger. Reviewing the Antonio's past, found inconsistencies. The name did not appear in official records. He had no military pension. There was no mention in decorations. But when consulting with contacts of the armed forces, obtained a fact that did pucker he frown. Antonio's license plate number coincided with that of a decorated and missing second lieutenant of the file since 2006. Eduardo dived in the case as it was done. Time does not. The more I investigated, and the clearer it became that Antonio Ribeiro was not a man common. I had been in high-risk missions in the Amazon and in the northern border, always as part of tactical units that operated in extreme conditions. A former commander, now retired, agreed to receive him. When Edward showed an old woman photograph found among the few documents of the accused, the man paled. He saved 5 of us in an ambush. It was wounded, but refused to evacuate until the last one was safe. Then he disappeared. According to Sedbu, Antonio was presumed dead after an air raid and never appeared again in the reports. Nobody had searched. Nobody claimed his name. Only Enrique Montenegro, the captain who survived thanks to him. He continued writing to him until his last days. With those stories, Eduardo prepared a new defense strategy. He requested an extension, asked access to military archives, and sought witnesses among forgotten veterans. Meanwhile, Antonio remained silently, sitting in his cell as if all that had nothing to do with he. He didn't speak a lot, just responded with monosyllables. But when he carried one of the letters that Henry had written, rescued of the Larissa's personal archive, the old man held the eyes and murmured something meaningful for the first time. He was good. He had eyes that looked clean. It was then Eduardo understood that behind that worn-out body lived a man who had given up everything, not out of cowardice, but because of a wound. He never knew how to close a wound called oblivion. The new audience was scheduled for a week later. This time, the room was more crowded. Several veterans had come forward voluntarily, some supported in walking sticks, others in wheelchairs. Many had not seen Antonio for decades, but they remembered. One by one, they gave testimony of his bravery, his leadership in combat, his silence afterward of trauma. Eduardo presented declassified documents confirming operations in those that Antonio had participated and survived, even when the statistics said that no one had to have left alive. It was revealed that his disappearance was consequence of an administrative confusion. He was presumed dead, and as he had no family registered nor public interest, its name was eliminated. In reality, he had been found seriously injured by peasants, and after months of recovery silently, he had chosen to disappear. Judge Larissa listened with the fists closed. I knew I was facing a moment that went beyond the written law. He was faced with a moral debt. When the last witness finished, the prosecutor asked the word. His tone had changed. He said he was withdrawing the charges for lack of criminal relevance, but he couldn't help but blush when he admitted that he had never seen a case transform so. Larissa breathed deep. It was removed the glasses and, for the first time since he took office, the position spoke from another place. She addressed Antonio, not as a judge, but as the sister of a man who I had to life. My brother Enrique died with your name in the mouth. He never stopped thanking you. Today am I who it makes. The room was in silence. Only one could hear the faint sob of a veteran in the background and the creak of a bench when someone stood up to applaud. The act, it was symbolic but profound. Antonio, still without fully understanding the stir to its around, was invited to stand up. Larissa descended from the platform, something that was not planned nor in protocol nor in a script of any court, and he held out a blue velvet box. Inside lay the Medal of the Order of the National Bravery, the highest distinction awarded for heroic acts in service of the country. With 20 years late, but with the same honor, he said while placed the decoration on the chest of the old man. Antonio did not cry. He closed the eyes and remained in silence, with the lips clenched and hands trembling, like someone who has just woken up from a long sleep without name. He was given a standing ovation, not as an act of charity, but of justice. The story arrived at the newscasts, not because of sensationalism, but because something in she moved even the most cynical. How was it possible that a war hero ends up abandoned, invisible, sleeping among garbage and bread old? On social media, the name Antonio Ribeiro became a symbol of everything that was wrong, and what is still wrong. To correct oneself in a country that so often forgets it's yours. In few days, a Veterans Association organized a campaign to help him. The Ministry of Defense issued a public note recognizing the administrative ruling that erased from the records, and with this not only restored their rights, but also his dignity. Finally, Antonio could have a place to sleep without fear. Not a cell, not an alley, but a home. The apartment was simple, but clean and bright. 2 rooms, a small kitchen, a bed with bed sheets new, and a window that looked out onto a garden common where they played children in the afternoon. Antonio settled in with the same caution within which a wild animal approaches the edge of the water, not knowing if he could trust. For years, his world had been the asphalt, the park benches, the tunnels from the subway. Now silence. It seemed strange, as if hiding something. At first, he slept with the door ajar and the lights on. But, little by little, his body was understanding that he no longer needed flee, that no one would come to throw him out, that that piece of space, finally, belonged. Larissa it visited days later, with a box in hand. Inside, carefully preserved, were all the cards that his brother Enrique had written since the war. Some were stained with dirt, others barely legible, but all preserved the voice of someone who had loved like a brother. Antonio read out loud fragments he didn't remember. He smiled as he read how Enrique did it, described as the most stubborn and brave man I have ever known, and closed the eyes when he found a line written shortly before he died. "If I don't come back, tell him I lived. With honor, thanks to him." Larissa stayed in silence. I didn't need to say anything. That moment was not for her, nor not even for his brother. It was for Antonio, so that he would know that it had not been in vain, that somewhere always it had remembered. From that moment on day, Antonio began to go out into the garden more frequently. I watched the neighbors without get too close, but with the attention of someone who had been for years trained to read gestures. He greeted with a slight nod of the head, and if any child you smiled, responded with a raised hand, timid but firm. One afternoon, one of those children are approached. He was wearing a school cadet uniform and did a perfect military salute. "My dad says that you are a real hero," he said with innocence. "Antonio." He smiled faintly and nodded. He said nothing, but something fell into place inside him, as if a missing piece had been fit back in. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a problem, not as a burden, but as someone who was worth remembering. Every morning, I made coffee and opened the window. He stopped turning on the light when he slept. He began to write small notes like short diaries, sometimes just single sentences. "Today the sun came in through the window. A cat fell asleep at my door. I didn't have fear," Larissa told him, taught to use an old engraver, and he began recording his voice reading fragments of Henry's letters. Not for anyone else to read, listen, but to listen to himself, same. In one of those recordings, said something that Larissa later found and never forgot. "The war didn't break me, forgetting did. But today, someone reminded me, and that rebuilt me." Nobody knew if it said to leave Constancy, or because in that moment finally, I believed it was true. As the months passed, Antonio's story stopped being in the headlines, but remained alive in who they met. In the veteran community, your name became reference. They were organized meetings where he was the guest of honor, although almost always I preferred sit in the back, listen, and quietly thank you. He never sought prominence. He just allowed himself smile when some ex-combatant had hugged him, and he said, "Thank you for not leaving you die." Sometimes, children from public schools would come to visit him with drawings and questions. They asked him to tell stories, but he barely shared anecdotes small. One sunrise in the jungle, a joke in Half of the Fear, a song he whistled his buddy wounded. I knew that the true horrors did not fit in words, and that the important thing was not the pain, but what one did with. Larissa, for her part, began to talk about him in lectures on justice and human rights. He said that, "Antonio, you taught more than any book, that the law needs eyes that see beyond of the file." Sometimes it was found rereading his letters, brother, now with a new meaning. Enrique had not only found a savior, he had found a mirror, a man with the same stubbornness to do it correct, although nobody I saw it. In her office, Larissa had a framed copy of the letter hung in which Enrique wrote, "Antonio doesn't believe he is a hero, but he is, because he chose stay when everyone was running away." Every time I looked that letter, I remembered why it was made, Judge, and why, in some days, it is worth not giving up in the face of coldness of the system. One winter day, Larissa received an unexpected call. Antonio. He had been hospitalized for pneumonia. It wasn't serious, but his age in the street had left footprints difficult to erase. She went to see him immediately. Upon entering the room, it found awake, looking out the window. I had oxygen in the nose and the face somewhat paler, but the eyes, they kept that calm that so much it was shocking. "I didn't come to say goodbye," he said, she trying to joke. Antonio, the looked and smiled, barely. "Nor I," he replied, with a raspy voice. They spoke little. There was no need to. You asked me to take care of the letters if anything happened. That I didn't would leave. Be lost again. Larissa promised that she would do. Then he sat down beside her, silently, while the sun filtered through the hospital window. The days following. They were slow, but Antonio got better. He returned to his apartment and resumed his routine of coffee, open windows, and recordings. Nocturnal. That experience, however, did write something he left on the table for Larissa to find in his next visit. It was a new letter, just a single sheet of paper, handwritten in shaky but steady handwriting. It read, "If I ever leave this world, I don't want to be remembered for the medals. I want to be remembered for having resisted, for not giving up, when no one else believed it was worth it, the pain." That phrase remained resonating in Larissa a lot after reading it, not only as a desire for a man greater, but as a manifesto, as a warning, as a promise. She decided then that your history would not be buried in files nor forgotten in speeches, that the would tell over and over again was just as it was born, the idea of the documentary. Larissa contacted a young filmmaker whom he knew from previous social cases. Together they convinced Antonio to record short interviews, to show his notebooks, to read letters in front of the camera. At first it was shown reluctant, but then agreed with one condition, that also appeared the others. "I am not the only one who was forgotten," he said. The project grew more than expected. Former soldiers, family members, historians and citizens common, they sent messages, stories, photos. The documentary was titled The Silent Hero and was broadcast on a national network. There was no awards nor red carpet, but in millions of homes, for 1 hour, Antonio Ribeiro stopped being invisible. The impact was immediate. Schools began to include their history in activities on memory and human rights. Young people, they wrote letters thanking him his example. Some volunteers organized to visit shelters and listen to other veterans who were still without name. Antonio. He watched everything from his armchair with the same calm as always. I wasn't looking for recognition, but there was something different in his gaze. Not pride, peace, as if after so many years of silence, his words finally, they would have found where stay. Larissa, sitting next to him, noticed that he talked more now. Not much, but enough. He commented the weather, asked about the children of the building. He read the newspaper. Details that for anyone would pass unnoticed, but he meant something immense. He was alive, not just breathing, living. On one of those quiet afternoons, Antonio decided to walk to the bakery where there was everything started. The same where it had been found sleeping behind the empty sacks, shivering with cold. This time, he entered through the main door. The young woman who attended it recognized instantly. It had seen in the documentary, and it invited to come in with a smile, nervous. "It's an honor to have you here, Mr. Ribeiro," he said. Antonio didn't respond immediately. He walked up to the display case and looked the steaming loaves and pointed to one with longing. "This was the one that smelled that night, made me think that I still worth. It's a shame to wake up." The young woman wrapped her bread delicately. He gave it to him, handed over without charging, and it received as if holding a trophy. Then he sat down at a table in the back and ate in silence, not because of hunger, because of closure. That gesture, small for others, marked a cycle that he himself didn't know he needed to close. He returned home with past firmer, as if something pending had been left resolved. That night, he recorded one last message in his recorder. The street made me forget who I was, but it didn't take away my who I was. Today, finally, I can remember it without pain. He kept the tape along with the letters and the diaries, all arranged in a wooden box that he placed in his closet. "When I am no longer here," he wrote on the outside, not with sadness, but with acceptance, like someone understood that some stories are not written to be kept, but to be passed on, forward like a fire that is lit in others. And he, at last, felt that he had compliment your part. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel. It's the only way to continue sharing stories worth telling. With he passed of the time, Antonio began to walk slower, to write less, but his gaze remained clear, as if he had found an internal compass. He no longer needed words. The neighbors they greeted with respect. Some it helped with shopping, others they just sat and talked. No one it was trying with pity. They saw it as a silent sage, someone who had seen the world up close and still, so preserved calm. One day, one of the children of the building, you asked me to go talk to him school. Antonio. He hesitated, but accepted. With his old coat and his patched shoes, he stood in front of a class full of curious eyes. He didn't talk about war or medals. He talked of the value of not judging by the appearance. How he cold of the street is nothing compared to he cold from oblivion. And it ended saying, being brave is not having fear. It is to keep walking, even though nobody looks. This quote move you. Subscribe. Every new history. Here we seek to honor those who they walk in silence. That one day, upon returning home, Larissa I expected in the entrance. He took her a copy printed from the documentary, now published as a book with images, testimonies, and some of Enrique's letters. "It's for you, and so that these words will never be lost again," he said. Antonio looked in long silence. He took the book carefully and said something that had never been said before. There was said, "Thank you. A daughter." It wasn't literal, but for both of them it rang true. There was born among them a bond that went beyond the justice or the gratitude. It was something like love, not a romantic one, nor paternal, a real human-born love of the recognition. She did it, hugged him, as if had been waiting all his life, and he, for the first time, didn't feel alone. If you felt something reading this, give me your subscription. It helps me keep doing visible to those the world forgot. They passed. The years, and Antonio, I didn't go out of the house as much anymore. I walked, supported in a cane that one of the neighbors you had given away, with his name carving in the wood. Its body was made more fragile, but his mind remained wake up. Every now and then, Larissa visited with coffee and bread sweet, as if they were repeating a ritual that never ended. They spoke little. They understood each other, with silences. You asked about his work, and you told of cases that had touched, of decisions, difficult days, in those who almost gave up. And always, in the end, he said it same. Do what is right, even if it hurts, even if they leave you alone. She nodded. Those words had become her beacon, a kind of unwritten code that he repeated like a mantra every time he doubted. Stories like this need to be told, but I can only continue if you subscribe. Will you join me? One morning, cold June, Larissa arrived as always, but there was no response to knocking. The door, it was closed, but not with key. Entered carefully and found in his armchair, asleep, with the book in a lap and the recorder on. Antonio had departed in peace, without suffering, like someone who decides to close the eyes after finishing a story. There was no note, no dramatic gesture, just a serene expression and the last tape in the recorder. Larissa, I'm listening over there, same. It was his voice, somewhat weaker, saying, if you are listening, this is because I'm gone. Don't cry. You found me. You gave me a name. You gave me a home. That's it. Was more than enough. She didn't cry right away. She sat down beside him, took his hand and stayed in silence, as if watching over a father, a friend, a teacher, as if it do for all those who could never say goodbye. The wake. It was intimate, but full of meaning. Larissa organized everything personally. She didn't allow it to be in a funeral home anyone, but in the headquarters of the Veterans Association, where Antonio had been honored years before. The coffin was covered by the flag that a day he had sworn to defend, and with her, Enrique's letters, the documentary book, and the Medal of the National Courage. People from everywhere came to say goodbye. Ex-soldiers, neighbors, children of the school, even people who just knew from television. Nobody cried with desperation. It was a crying content, serene, like someone who thanks someone who leaves a legacy. Many, they said it same as he passed in front of the coffin. Thank you for not giving up. Larissa, standing next to the box, felt that each face was an echo of the same miracle. Someone who had been remembered in time. After the burial, she did not return immediately to work. It took a few days, not out of sadness, but to organize something that was already had been brewing for months. Creation of the Antonio Ribeiro Institute, a center of memory, training, and assistance to ex-combatants and people in homeless situation. The project was approved with unusual speed. There was public resonance. There was political will, but above all, there was a story that could not be forgotten. Larissa used her savings, looked for sponsors, and when the institute opened its doors at the entrance, there was a plaque with an engraved phrase, "Oblivion was his battle, memory, his victory." Since then, every year, on June 14th, the day of his departure, a day of respect for the invisible, where you listen to those who no one hears, and honor those who history did not know right. The institute was not long in coming in becoming a reference point. Ex-soldiers, they began to arrive from other states to tell their stories, to receive medical care, and above all, feeling seen. Volunteers offered to accompany, listen, and teach. Larissa oversaw every detail with the same delivery with the one who had defended Antonio, but she wasn't looking for recognition. I just wanted no one else to end up in the street for having been forgotten. In one of the main rooms, a project was being made, the documentary on loop, and in a quiet corner, a small library kept Antonio's writings, diaries, recordings, letters, all preserved, all available, like a map of dignity for those who I would like to follow in his footsteps. People sat there to read it, like someone who converses with someone wise, and many, they came out of that space with a phrase in the lips, "I remember." One day, a young journalist asked to interview Larissa. He asked her why there was done so much by one man. She smiled, breathed deep, and said, "Because he was one among millions. But for me, it was he first thing he taught me what is true justice." The journalist remained silent. There was nothing more to ask. As she left, she noticed that in front of the institute, a child played with a toy car and wore a T-shirt with he Antonio's face stamped. The boy looked at him and he said, "My grandfather says that he saved many people without them knew." And he went back to playing as if nothing had happened. But the seed was there. In the street, in the history, in the echo of a life that did not go out with the death, but found in the memory of the others the most powerful way to stay alive. Larissa grew old with he time, like everyone else, but he never strayed from his promise. He continued telling the Antonio story in lectures, books and interviews, not as a martyr, but as an example of what can be passed when someone dares to look beyond the appearance. Always he said that the true justice does not begin with laws, but with eyes that see and ears that hear. When received an international award for his work, dedicated to him, to the one who taught me to remember, to the one who taught me to feel. His voice broke as he said it, but not out of sadness. It was pride, pride in having been part of something that transcended positions, courts, or medals. June 14th, she returned to the cemetery where he rested Antonio. He was carrying hot coffee and bread, sweet. He sat next to her and talked in a low voice. He told her what there was passed in the institute, who there was arrived new, how many veterans had been accommodated, what child there was, said something funny. It was like visiting an old friend who followed there, present. Once he left a tape recorder on the tombstone and put on one of his old tapes. You could hear Antonio's voice saying, "If you remember me, I didn't leave at all." And she, smiling, replied, "Then you are still here." The story of Antonio Ribeiro was taught then in universities, not just as a legal case, but as a lesson in humanity. Articles were written, films were made, but nothing surpassed the impact it caused when Larissa counted in person. Because it toward with true, because it toward with love. He said that every word of Antonio's you had changed his life, that if he had saved his brother in the jungle, he that had saved her in the city. One afternoon, a woman elderly, I was walking with his granddaughter on a street from the center. As we passed by a mural with Antonio's face, the little girl asked who she was. The woman replied without doubt, "A man who fought so that no one was forgotten." And they continued walking, without knowing that simple sentence closed the circle of a life that had finally been honored. If this story reminded you that no one who gave everything for the others should be forgotten, tap, like, say, and write in the comments. Me, I remember, because sometimes that's enough to honor the one who deserves it. If you made it this far, thank you. Your subscription keeps this mission alive, to give voice to those who never had one microphone. Subscribe and share if you remember.